Alright everyone, I thought I'd do something non-political first today. It's something that, I've wanted to do for a while, but I hadn't watched Rogue One as far as the Star Wars stuff goes. Now, of course, there are spoilers in this video, as though you couldn't fucking figure that out to begin with. Most of you have probably watched it. At the very least, you probably watched the original trilogy. A lot of people, after episode 1, they're like, oh, fuck this, and they didn't watch any of them beyond that. I'm going to give my honest sort of ratings for the Star Wars movies. I'm going to start at episode 1. It just makes sense to do that. Some of these ratings deviate wildly from what a lot of people actually put on there, and sometimes they come with a few qualifications, but I figured I'd go through it because it's been a while since I've done anything that's not political. I also want to do some more occult videos fairly soon, so I figured I'd go through it. Makes a good start to the day, I suppose, to have something that's, not on something related to Trump, Clinton, or Venezuela, which is like 50% of it at this point, because the news never stops. The news cycle's 24/7. It's filled with insanity. So first we've got episode 1. What I would say about this, before giving the ratings here, I'll justify it first. The things I liked about it are, anytime that the CGI was applied to something where you've got a faraway shot, like in outer space, like of a large fleet, or up close but something fast moving, like pod races, it was okay. At every other possible juncture, it falls apart completely. That's one of the main problems with episode 1 and 2 especially, is really the CGI doesn't hold up at all. A lot of people don't like the acting. I think that it was the result of a slightly gawky script more than anything else. It's like the third Jurassic Park movie. Here you've got a group of actors that they're not bad actors. You watch them in other roles. They're fine. It's because the script was weak, specifically. The script for episode 1 was very, very bad, all things considered. It was very hokey. Now, like with young Anakin, a lot of people are like, well, it was a totally unlovable character, totally forgettable. I'm like, well, little kids do cringy things. It's sort of like episode 2. I'll talk about that as well, of course. The big takeaway for it, my favorite thing about the movie was the pod racing. Because it wasn't just within the context of the movie. You've got to understand, for people in my generation, it also became like a video game, a bunch of Legos. That was pretty cool. It's like episode 1 was no longer just Star Wars encapsulated as a movie. It was every other product too. Kind of like with the initial trilogy, but at the time on steroids, because of the way in which technology was beginning to change. People are getting more into video games, especially on home consoles, certainly, than in the mid to late 70s. It's a little bit of a different culture. Ultimately, though, I give it a 6 out of 10. I think it was a highly enjoyable movie that's actually rewatchable. Again, the reason why the pod racing is good, I can overlook the bad acting, because it's like, well, it's the first Star Wars movie in a long time. It's a new generation of movies. The CGI, it's like, it doesn't hold up, but, unless you're specifically watching for it, it's not a big thing. I mean, it doesn't affect the plot. I actually sort of like the more drama side of, Lucas episodes 1, 2, and 3, whereas 4, 5, and 6, of course, it's, basically pure action. There's something to be said for that, but there's also something to be said for character development. But that leads us right into episode 2, and I'm going to give the rating up front a 2 out of 10. It was a terrible movie. Specifically because of not only the acting, but the character development. What character development? There really isn't any now. A lot of people are like, well, actor playing young Anakin is very, very cringy and terrible. I don't think so. The idea of portraying, a young male as cringy, maybe sexually awkward at many times, that makes sense. That's like, every other young male. So I'm not really going to give it 0 credit for that. The big problem is that somehow the CGI became worse from episode 1. That's number 1. The acting was more poor. It was even more wooden. For the most part, for the most part it was. Number 2, that's a big problem for me. Number 3, instead of having, like with episode 1, there's action, but it's more on the drama side. With episode 2, where's the action? There's relatively little. The biggest, most fun part is really the final fighting that goes on But even then, with the up-close shots, again, the CGI falls apart completely. Again, the development of the storyline sort of is nothing more than the lead-up to Episode 3. That is, that Episode 2 is really just one long drama-filled filler that takes you from sort of the origin story of Episode 1, here's Anakin and blah, 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 through the development of his relationship with Padme that will become more relevant in 3. There's relationship with Obi-Wan that will become more relevant in Episode 3. The formation of the Republic's army that will become more relevant in Episode 3. A lot of it is literally nothing more than a transference from 1 to 3. For that reason, I would say Episode 2 is only rewatchable if you're binging and watching the whole thing from Episode 1 all the way up through. If you're trying to, like, say, hey, I'm going to take an entire day, I'm going to get up, start with Episode 1 and coffee, and then watch every fucking Star Wars movie, by the way, by the end of the day, be very, very tired. You won't enjoy the last few. And then you'd have to watch Episode 2, otherwise I wouldn't really bother. And people have criticized even, like, I thought it was novel, you know, as again, a young millennial, seeing Yoda come back and fight with a lightsaber, I thought was pretty cool. But yeah, the fighting is not the best, not the best effects with that either. With Episode 3, I'd give it a 5 out of 10, up front again here. It's a good movie. It's decent. The acting's a bit better. The effects are certainly upgraded from 1 and 2. Although, again, like with 1 and 2, the biggest problem is that when you're in an up-close shot, a slow shot, the CGI is terrible. But you open up the movie almost, you know, right away with this massive-ass battle over Coruscant, and, you know, you're looking down at this huge battle with all of these ships exploding and lasers everywhere. That looks pretty good. The lightsaber battles are a little bit better than, like, you know, Yoda versus Dooku. Right off the bat, of course, you know, he gets slaughtered. And then towards the end, of course, Anakin transfers fully to the dark side. You know, Mace Windu gets killed. And then things just sort of go from there, and Anakin goes crazy, kills all the Jedi children and everything, and becomes totally insane. I thought the final battle here, which is almost, I believe, like 20 minutes of non-stop lightsaber duel between him and Obi-Wan, very good, except for right at the end, it is totally anticlimactic. Anakin tries to force jump over Obi-Wan, gets his arms and legs slashed off, basically. That's basically it. Now he's burning in a crater. Somehow, they never quite explain how he managed to survive this. He's lost 3 limbs. He's on fire, sitting next to a pool of fucking lava on a planet that is slowly falling apart and getting ready, I guess, to explode or something. Somehow he manages to survive. I guess the Force is really, really strong with him, despite the fact that he just went completely insane. I'd give it a 5 out of 10. It's not a bad movie. I think personally, and this is an unpopular opinion, it's less rewatchable than Episode 1. Then we come to the first of the classic trilogy, Episode 4, A New Hope. 8 out of 10, easily. Very, very good movie. There's not much more to say. It's got good acting. It's got a good plot line. For the time, the effects were quite good. The one major problem I really had with it is that Mark Hamill in the first Star Wars movie, because he was basically making his major film debut, his acting was actually not that good. Nobody wants to criticize it, but Mark Hamill's acting in Episode 4 wasn't that solid. It was, again, it was a little bit more like Anakin in Episode 2 than anything. Now, by the next episode, of course, his acting is much more solid, but you gotta realize why he was chosen for that role. Originally, Luke was supposed to be a heartthrob. It wasn't Han Solo. Han Solo's just the roguish, you know, suave dude who's like kind of a ladies' man, but, you know, he wasn't meant to be the main heartthrob. It was Luke that was meant to be. He was supposed to be this beach blonde sort of surfer boy, which is literally what he was before he went into acting. Did you know this, by the way? He was literally sort of a pin-up boy model for the girls' magazines before he got into Star Wars. That's what Luke was originally. Back in the mid-70s, the bleach blonde kid with the pudding bowl haircut looking a little bit like a latter-day Beatle, that was what was considered attractive. Now, by Return of the Jedi, that style is totally fucking dead. But here's the thing, there's really no major criticism with regards to the movie. It's absolutely iconic. The only problem is the main protagonist at times isn't acting maybe fully believably. Most of the rest of the cast, true, did a good job. Also, you don't have the Imperial March yet. That's another thing. And I would say the music of the subsequent Star Wars is more iconic. That's really when Star Wars goes from, really popular to, oh my god, it's like taking over the world. Leading us then into the only 10 out of 10 Star Wars, which is Episode 5. Now, if Disney wanted to make me happy, because I'll get to the ratings of their films so far in a minute. If they wanted to make me happy, they would also make Shadows of the Empire, which was a contemporary sort of thing to Episode 5, which was quite good. But as far as Episode 5 goes, basically all of the most iconic things about Star Wars as a franchise start here, really, when you think about it. You've got the Battle for Hoth, the most famous battle of all of Star Wars. I think probably even more famous than running down, the side of the Death Star to blow that up. It spawned its own video game. That one battle scene practically spawned the video game contemporary to it, Shadows of the Empire, which is more or less canonical. That one uses Dash Rendar. The acting is much more solid, especially from the lead protagonist. You've got Yoda, which is important, and some of his funny lines. You've got the addition of Londo, which is, I think, personally quite important as a character to develop Han Solo especially, and Leia. And then you have, Cloud City, which at the time, if you look at it, even on the remasters, it's quite good. The way that they depict it. As opposed to maybe, a little bit more crude animation for some of the stuff in Episode 4. Episode 5 perfects it. It becomes more like a late 70s movie than a mid-70s movie. It becomes more strictly sci-fi as well. It gets kind of darker and weirder, especially in Yoda's swamps there. As opposed to before, you've got this desert planet, everything's bright, and then you've got, sequences in space, which were kind of overexposed at the time for some reason, by the way. Episode 5 is a much more dark film. It starts to look like some of the settings that you get, the very rich, varied, dark, gritty settings that you get in a lot of the 80s horror movies. It begins to look a lot like that, including Yoda as a puppet at the time. Which, by the way, you'd never know was a puppet. It looked like, maybe they had a dwarf in a costume. Solid acting, solid effects for the era, iconic storyline, even more so than A New Hope, especially the Battle for Hoth. And just a generally fast-paced movie as well. Very action-packed. Most of the movie is Han and then the others fleeing away from various Imperial forces, and Luke is going out to train with Yoda. The battle with Darth Vader, again, totally iconic at the time. Him getting his hand cut off and so forth. You begin that sort of psychological symbolism that really is a hallmark of Star Wars. Then we have Return of the Jedi, Episode 6. I actually think of the initial trilogy, it's the weakest, but people used to consider it the best, now they consider it more weak. It didn't hold up quite as well over time. I give it a 7 out of 10. It's a good movie. There's totally nothing wrong with it. It's still a very good film. It's just that when you compare it to A New Hope or Empire Strikes Back, it's not quite as good. And again, unpopular opinion, I have no problem with Ewoks. I thought the addition to the Ewoks was pretty cool, although if you look at the Battle for Endor, there's a little bit of non-canonical content there. I'll get into that a little bit. It's been said by other people, Wicket learned how to speak English before Return of the Jedi. Why then did he regress and stop speaking English? Maybe because he grew to hate that little family there that he tried to save, including Wilford Brimley, by the way, at the time. Funny thing. Most people don't even know those videos exist. I would say Return of the Jedi, as far as effects, as far as, lightsaber duel at the end, that was fantastic. Hamill's acting, the lightsaber scenes toward the end, that's really the takeaway from the movie. Here's the problem, though. In the final battle, the destruction of the Death Star is not quite as impressive as in Episode 4. Some of the movie is a little bit more slow-paced, and a little bit too psychological, too, in the sense of, Luke's interpersonal relationship with Leia, and it's you're my sister. Remember that time we practically made out in front of Han, who you're going to be making out with and making babies with later? The same one that's going to fuck up the entire Jedi thing. Okay. It gets a little bit weird. I don't have a problem with the Ewoks, although that was a little bit of... They could have shortened up elements of the battle between, the Ewoks and the Rebel forces down on Endor and the and the Imperial forces. That was a little bit elongated. It gets a little bit old. It's like, okay, the Ewoks have invented interesting ways to kill AT-ATs and stuff. I mean, AT-STs and all these other machines. Okay, how many more ways do they have? It's like, oh, we're going to trip this one, smash this one with logs. We're going to, there's going to be rocks everywhere. It doesn't, and yeah, it gets a little bit old. It's not the Ewoks' fault, which I think they hired midgets for those roles. I wonder if they hired any kids. They're like, hey, you're just a really short kid. Get into this costume. We'll give you $10. You don't have to do much. Just jump around and fire this little crude bow or whatever. The acting's solid. There's no major problem. It's just that compared to the movie before, it's just not as polished. The pacing is a little bit off, and of course, it's just not quite as much there. It's not a bad movie. I'm not criticizing it per se. I'm just saying it's less enjoyable to watch. It has less rewatch value. I've watched Episode 5 dozens of times. Return of the Jedi, I've rewatched it a couple of times. There's a little bit of a difference. Then we get to the modern movies. Now, this is where the Lucas era ends, other than, the Ewok movies and the Christmas special. And then you have Episode 7, ultimately. Episode 7, Force Awakens. I would give it a 5 out of 10. It's solid. It's an okay movie. It's just, for me, it has no rewatch value. Like, looking back at it, I can remember some scenes from the movie, like especially early on when, character who I honestly couldn't tell you the name of because it's less memorable is zooming around in Tatooine. And then you have, it's basically, here's the biggest problem that I have with Episode 7, is that Disney took A New Hope and repackaged it. That's all they did. It is almost the same exact story. If you look at it, look. Force-sensitive person on Tatooine, droid comes, secret plans are involved, ends up with the rebellion, ends up in with a bunch of other miscreants, basically, has to go find, the old Jedi Master, except it's not Kenobi this time, it's Luke Skywalker. It's funny how, it's almost a little bit like Episode 1, too. That had elements of Episode 4 in it. It's almost like the trilogy keeps repeating and being repackaged for each new generation. So Outcast with a weird history from Tatooine is going off to find the Jedi Master, although doesn't find him till the end. Of course, Luke Skywalker ends up helping to destroy the planet-killing machine. Where have we seen this plot before? The difference is that it's got much better CGI than the prequel movies, obviously better effects than some of the stuff from the initial trilogy, which is 4, 5, and 6. It's funny how they're out of order because Lucas determined that, maybe with the effects capable in the 1970s, making an army of 1 million droids is not feasible budget-wise. Maybe I'll just start with 4. I think I will just have a lot of close-in shots. It'll be easier. And indeed, I think he made the right decision. Imagine if Lucas had made Episodes 1, 2, and 3 first. Would Star Wars have been the same franchise? Would it have been as monumental? I don't think it would. I think it would have fallen flat, actually, and probably there would only be one Star Wars movie, and it would be in the dustbin of history. But Episode 7's like, the one thing I really like about it is the arrival of a villain that actually feels somewhat believable. Cringy, yes, deliberately. Now, sort of like, Episode 2 Anakin, only actually capable of fighting properly. Doesn't get his hand immediately cut off, I guess. I actually like Kylo Ren. More as a villain than better than Darth Maul, better certainly than Grievous or Dooku or any of these other characters. I think honestly is a good addition to the franchise. More troubled and more complex than Darkseid Anakin was in Episode 3, but certainly more complex than Dooku, which totally, here you've got Christopher fucking Lee is playing a villain. It should be perfect, but because of the poor writing and the reliance on CGI, falls flat. Kylo Ren, I think, is much better. And that's ultimately one of the only main points of Episode 7 that I actually like, is the addition of a villain that feels somewhat believable. Again, somewhat of an unpopular opinion at times. Otherwise, it's basically a rehash of A New Hope. And I think that that's regrettable because they could have done more with it. With effects the way that they are now, they could have done more. Then we come to 8. I personally thought it was quite good. It's better than 7. Kylo Ren becomes even more complex and believable. The one bitch I have about it is probably the same thing echoed by everyone else, which is they really mistreated Luke. The idea of Luke milking this weird walrus cow or whatever it is by the side of the sea and drinking this weird green milk and sort of having a weird look at what's her name there, the forgettable new Luke Skywalker character, no, it doesn't work for me. It shows him as being overly bitter. Like, until the very end, he's just like this sad, bitter old man. He was totally mistreated. I think he has misgivings about his reprisal of this role. He's not even technically a main character, but one of the best things is right towards the end. Literally, the ending was quite good, with the rebels holding out in that salt mine or whatever it was. It's pretty awesome. The effects were fantastic. And the musical score was fantastic as well. It harkens back to episode 4 or 5. Really, it's more dramatic, it's more fleshed out than like what you get with the prequels. It's like okay, but a lot of that was just straight rehash. Or it was new and it wasn't good. One of the best things about episode 1 was the Gungan City. No, but 7 was good. It's a solid movie. It's rewatchable. Episode 7, not so much. Like, I might watch it again, sometime. Episode 8, though, is highly rewatchable. I would enjoy rewatching it for some of the fight scenes, some of the character development. The ending is more solid, I think, than episode 7's was. The problem is Luke is mistreated. Again, you have certain elements that are kind of slow-paced, or a little bit confusing, actually. Like the part, again, with forgettable protagonists down in the dark side pit, or whatever it is. It kind of doesn't make, it's not 100% fully explained, and at first it's a little bit jarring because it seems like the character is talking to herself in the third person. Then it turns out, of course, she's describing this to Kylo Ren, who her mind is somehow linked with by Snoke, who's, I think his name is Snoke, who's sort of forgettable too. It's like, could have been a much better villain. Could have been another Palpatine, unfortunately didn't materialize into one and ends up getting killed under very strange circumstances and supposedly is like basically all powerful. Now we come to Rogue One, which I actually got done watching literally the other day. That's why I finally watched it, so I figured I'd do this. I give it a 7 out of 10. Very good movie. Yeah, it was actually surprising. I didn't expect myself to like it as much. And it's only semi-canonical. Essentially, for those that don't know, Rogue One is the bridger between Episode 3 and Episode 4, explaining the very short period of time that leads up to the rebels gaining the plans to the Death Star. Death Star has just been completed. There's a critical flaw built into it by its sort of scientific main engineer, main founder. And it's the story of how this group of rebels has managed to get those plans to the Rebel Alliance at large. The ending is fantastic. This is easily, of all of the non-original trilogy movies, Rogue One has the best ending, by far. It's got, for those that haven't watched it again, major spoiler, it's badass Vader. And I mean total badass. He's walking down this corridor towards the rebel ship. Right as they're about to board the rebels, before they break away, and then of course they send the pod down to Tatooine, and Episode 4 begins. What happens is that Vader starts walking down this corridor, the lighting's perfect, the sound is perfect, and he just starts slaughtering everything. He's waving his sword, his lightsaber around, and using the Force to choke people and throw them against walls. He's absolutely crushing them. And you just get the sense this is a person who you don't want to mess with because you won't survive. And of course the plans, they manage to get it through the airlock to the ship leaves, they send the droids down, and then, and another good thing about this is the very, very strange CGI Tarkin. That is that they took footage of Tarkin from the original trilogy and readapted it to bring him back to life for this movie. I don't know if it'll hold up in time because it's obviously, if you look closely, it's obviously computer generated. But it's really good. It's really good for the current generation of computer equipment. I liked it. They also have CGI young Leia, although that's a little less believable, in all honesty. 7 out of 10. The acting was okay. It was better than, like, Episode 7. and better than the prequels. I will give it that. The effects were very good. The ending was very good. The musical score was quite good. And even though it's not 100% canonical, it is a story that kind of needed to be told because, you get this really heavy moment in Return of the Jedi where like, oh, all these people died getting us these plans and we got to destroy the Death Star and it's like blah, blah, blah. And it's, in A New Hope, actually, sorry. And they never really explain anything about the story of how all of those people died. Now, you've got some non-believable moments. This is why it isn't like an 8 out of 10. The Chinese martial arts master, blind, force-aware individual who kills 20, 30 stormtroopers with his fucking stick, that's a little bit out there. Because he's not even a Jedi, he shouldn't be able to do that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He's got his rather large-looking companion there. Some of the characters weren't fully believable. And the acting is, at times, a little bit off. Otherwise, it was a really good movie. I actually really enjoyed it. Now we have the Christmas special. How do I class this? It's not so much canonical story as it is just a Star Wars offshoot film. I give it a 3 out of 10, and I'll tell you why. I would give it a 0, or if I could give it a negative score, I would. I'll give it a 3 specifically because it is so bad that it becomes hilarious. It's like a hilarious placeholder in what could have been in the weird fever dream moments of George Lucas, really thinking, oh, this will be good. Let's have a Wookiee Christmas, and then we won't even give any subtitles to the Wookiees. And we won't even explain what they're saying, and so it sort of falls apart. And then you've got Leia at the end singing, what is it, the Life Song or something. Oh my god, it's standard, like, late 70s insanity. It's so fucking insane. I think it was in the late 70s. Or was it after Return of the Jedi? For some reason, I think it was a little bit before that. It was terrible. Watch the Star Wars Christmas special if you want to waste, 45 minutes or something, doing something that you won't actually enjoy it afterwards. You'll be like, yeah, you'll get a chuckle out of it afterwards. You managed to sit through it. Congratulations, you're ready for Gitmo. Now we have actually 2 movies that most people don't know exist. More people, I think, know about the Christmas special. By the way, I haven't seen the Han Solo movie, so I can't rate it. I anticipate it won't be quite as good as Rogue One. Although I've heard mixed reviews, it's like basically action movie, not a lot of plot. That sounds okay, I guess, for an afternoon. We have to talk about the Ewok Adventure and the Battle for Endor, respectively a 4 and a 5 in ratings. Now, that means they're not terrible. They're just not great. Ewok Adventure is basically the boring and forgettable adventure of the blonde-haired little girl and her brother trying to rescue their parents, all of which, by the way, will be dead in the next movie. And it's very boring, and the plot meanders, and a lot of things aren't explained, and they've actually got Burl Ives as the narrator for this movie. It's obviously geared towards a younger audience than the original trilogy. This is not a PG-13 endeavor like, Luke getting his hand cut off. This is easily a G-rated movie, although at the end, the scary giant dude in the caverns, like, with the hideous mask, yeah, a little bit frightening. They have that classic stop motion sort of early 80s stuff in it. It's like very Muppet style, but for maybe more scary purposes. It's actually, as a little kid, it was a little bit terrifying. Like some of these giant creatures, like the one looks like a big deformed wolf. Another one is like the giant dude, and then the next movie you have like Planet of the Apes army, basically. And it's a little bit, for a younger audience, I would think a little bit too scary, like for some, 4-year-old or something. They'd have nightmares, probably. A lot of 80s movies did have you ever seen Dark Crystal? Or, what was it? I think, what was it? Wizard of Oz 2, certainly. That one with the witch there that's just like totally crazy and murderous. No, Ewok Adventure is highly forgettable. You should watch it, but you're gonna forget most of the plot details. Battle for Endor is a little bit better. The plot, there's a little bit more action, and it's basically, again, Sindel, this little girl, and Wicket, actually from Return of the Jedi, believe it or not. Wicket basically traveling around. They end up finding Wilford Brimley, of all people, who's playing sort of this castaway former, I guess, star pilot or something. And they have to basically get home, but they are opposed by this army of ape-looking dudes that want, like, some sort of battery they want to get it working again because they think it's like the ultimate power or religiously important or something. And Wilfred Brimley ends up using, of course, this battery to power his ship, which they use then at the end to go home. They escape from Endor. The battle for Endor is won. And then she obviously never goes back to visit Wicket because by Return of the Jedi, he's stopped speaking English properly. So there's a little bit about the Star Wars movies. I don't have any editing equipment, so I don't have graphics or anything like that for the review, but that's basically what I think anyway. It's an interesting subject. I'm not a Star Wars super fan, but I thought I'd go through that. That's about all. Peace out.